Hi, it's John Sellars speaking to you from London in the UK, and this is the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast.
Welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast, a podcast dedicated to exploring the applied philosophy of traditional Stoicism. The College of Stoic Philosophers is an online school founded in 2008. We at the college endeavor to educate all who would be Stoics and Stoic philosophers who aspire to the good life within the world community. Podcast episodes will include discussions of Stoic history, application, interviews, and much more, all while having some fun, fate permitting. I'm your host, Mark Sterry. Thank you for tuning in and welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. Dr. John Sellars, welcome to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. How's it going today there, John?
Yeah, it's going very well, and thank you so much for inviting me on.
Yes, John Sellars is a reader in the history of philosophy at Royal Holloway University in London. Some of the books he's written is The Art of Living, Stoicism, Hellenistic Philosophy, Marcus Aurelius, and more. Where are you zooming in from today, John?
I'm based in Oxford in the UK. This is my home, and but I teach in London or just outside London, as you mentioned a moment ago.
And we also have Kathy Bucher here to help me co-host this episode. And John, what's your weather like over there?
Terrible. It's dark and gloomy and wet, the middle of winter.
I can tell you, John, that in Seattle, it's the same way. We're calling them atmospheric rivers these days, though, not rain.
I can tell you here from St. Paul, Minnesota, it is the same way also. Just playing outside with the dogs before this, getting them worn out so I can do this podcast interview, and it is dark and gloomy and as well. So, first of all, when did you find out that the college used your textbook, Stoicism, as our Stoic Essential Studies textbook?
A long time ago. I can't remember when precisely. I think someone brought it to my attention. I think not long after that happened. I was very fortunate in that when the book first came out, which was back in 2006, it was co-published by the University of California Press, and so I suspect that because it, quite literally came out in California, that helped in it being noticed by the college.
Yeah.
The cover's great. It's got this interesting texture. How much control did you have over the presentation of the book?
For the most part, you have very little control. I did choose the cover image, though, the painting by Rubens of the dying Seneca.
Yeah.
And I remember after it came out, there were a few people that were saying, well, that's not a very attractive image. That's not going to draw anyone to Stoicism. But I was particularly interested in Rubens at the time and the circle of neo-Stoics around him and his interest in Seneca. And it seemed like a really interesting moment in the kind of the subsequent take-up of Stoic ideas. So that was one reason why I wanted to kind of have that image in particular.
Have you ever considered doing an audio version of these books?
No, I haven't. I don't think that's really been an option with that book in particular, although you never know, it might be a possibility in the future. I wrote a much shorter book aimed at a very wide audience for people coming to the subject for the first time. And in the UK, that's called Lessons in Stoicism. The US edition is called The Pocket Stoic. And I know that there's an audio version of that book out there, although I didn't record it myself.
Mike, can I jump in here?
Yeah, of course.
One of the reasons, John, that we love using your book in our first course, and our first course is 16 weeks long. It's for people who are, I sometimes call them tourists. They're coming to Stoicism, but they want a little bit of that scholastic tone, which your book provides them, so they move away from sort of the modern familial kind of chat around the online and get finally into some seriousness, and as well as the fact that it covers the three topoi. It touches on logic and physics as well as ethics. But we really wanted that seriousness for our students as they start, because we think philosophy is a serious business, actually. So that's why we've stayed with it so long, and and appreciate the fact the prices just come down on Amazon, so it's easier for them to buy it now too.
Well, I mean, so it's had I mean, thank you so much for all those kind comments. I mean, the book had a kind of interesting publication history. So, I mean, I originally sold the idea to a fairly small UK publisher who were sort of, independent and open to new ideas, who were called Acumen. And I met with those guys in London and we sorted it all out. They then sold the US rights to University of California Press, which was obviously fantastic. I don't know about this, I'm just speculating, but one of the readers for the book for Acumen was A.A. Long, Tony Long. Yeah. And I wonder whether he might have been the person who suggested that University of California Press might be interested in it, given that he'd published works with them and was on the ground. Mm-hmm. But that's just speculation on my part.
That's just fate, right?
Yes, exactly. And then a few years later, Acumen were bought out by Routledge, and Routledge reprinted it. And in the process, they decided to buy back the rights from California so that they could sell it worldwide. And right now, I mean, literally right now, this week, at the moment, I'm finalizing a new, revised, updated version of the book, where I'm tweaking various things that I've come to be slightly unhappy with. And Routledge will publish that new revised edition, hopefully next year.
Oh, that's great news. Wonderful for us, too.
So, John, where did you get the initial idea to put out this book? Like, were you sitting at a coffee shop and like, I think I should write a book on Stoicism. How did this all come about?
So, I mean, I suppose there are a couple of different ideas behind it. I mean, one was simply a very pragmatic one. I just finished my PhD. I was going onto the job market. I wanted to get my name out there. And one way to do this is to write a book like this that will actually sort of be read by a slightly larger audience than just kind of very specialized academic publications. So that was one element of it, which was very pragmatic. But another idea, which I think is really a key motivation for many writers, is the feeling that I wish such a book had existed when I was first starting out. Right. So, there's a book that you wish existed and it's not there. Right. So I wanted to kind of fill that gap. And also, again, having just finished my PhD, starting to do little bits of teaching, there was also a sense in which, there isn't an obvious book that I could direct my sort of, first students to that would cover all the bases for them. So those were, I think, the real motivating forces. So just one last thought as well. Something else that I wanted to do was the few much earlier books that try to introduce Stoicism, often, dating back to the 60s or 70s even, the kind of academic culture at the time amongst ancient philosophers was to focus on the early Greek Stoics, right? It's all about Chrysippus and his interest in logic and knowledge and all of these sorts of questions. And it was only very recently, when I was working on this book, that people started to pay a bit more serious attention to the Roman Stoics. And so again, A.A. Long had only recently written his book on Epictetus that came out a couple of years earlier. Mm-hmm. Brad Inwood was starting to write his stuff on Seneca, but hadn't pulled it all together into the book that he published on that subject. And so another key motivation was to write a synthetic study that would talk about the later Roman Stoics and the early Greek Stoics side by side, as if they were all part of one tradition, rather than having them separated out.
It's wonderful, and it worked. I think you asked the college, our College of Stoic Philosophers, if we had any recommendations for you about the book. I hope you received some feedback from us. I don't know if you did or not.
Yes, I did. Thank you. I received one or two emails, and I had a very interesting video chat with someone as well, and got various comments. So that's helpful, and those will all feed into my revising process.
Good.
So writing that back in 2006, what's the main thing that you look to alter or change in the book? Is there something like you disagree with? Have you learned something more about certain subjects of Stoicism? What's the biggest thing you would alter in the new book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, there are lots of little bits of fine tuning. There are odd bits that I think were perhaps slightly hastily written. But in terms of the kind of core philosophical ideas, there are a number of things that I would want to revise, or that I am revising. So, I mean, one of those is the idea that the three parts of Stoic philosophy correspond with the three topoi in Epictetus. I mean, I'm not convinced of that view anymore. I mean, it was an idea that Pierre Hadot first put forward,
Right.
and others have repeated it. And I've repeated it in past work, but I'm not so sure that really works anymore. And I wrote something more recently on why I think that's not so convincing. I don't think that's a really big deal in the wider scheme of things, but I think I wouldn't push that as hard as I have in the first version. Another thing that I've become increasingly wary of is, so it's quite common for people to say that the Stoics believed or were committed to a doctrine of apatheia, avoiding all emotions. And then people say, yes, so they believe in apatheia, but also there are these things called the eupatheiai, the good emotions. And so you immediately qualify that statement, right? And then it all starts to get a bit messy and confusing. And again, very recent study I read, published in French, which challenges the idea that the Stoics ever seriously believed in apatheia. And in this book, she goes through and she says, well, actually, the vast majority of the ancient texts that talk about this doctrine are quite hostile critics of the Stoics. There's a sense in which that idea is being foisted on them by their opponents, and that we shouldn't use that word apatheia quite so strongly in relation to the Stoics. Maybe that's the critic the critics of Stoicism that are using that term, not the Stoics themselves so much. I mean, we do find it a little bit in Epictetus, but as we all know, the Stoics aren't cold, emotionless blocks of stone, right?
No.
We feel, we think, we respond to situations. There's that space for good emotions that is obviously a core part of their theory. So that was another thing that I certainly wanted to update.
And you can't get rid of the little s Stoicism in our lexicon any longer. I think it's just too deeply embedded. This use of the word Stoicism as essentially apatheia in all of us. But I'm so happy to hear you say this, because it has been my impression that that Stoicism is full of emotion, and but it's how they work it. And it is not that they deny it. And I hope that some additional entry of women and others who come from different perspectives might also help us understand this even more. So delighted to hear you say that you've re-looked at it.
Yeah, thank you.
John, do you mind sharing with us how you discovered Stoicism initially?
Yes. So, I mean, I guess that's a fairly long, complicated story. I mean, it dates back to when I was an undergraduate studying philosophy in the early 1990s. I mean, I certainly stumbled across Marcus Aurelius and read the Meditations and thought it was fascinating, and absolutely nothing like any of the books I was being presented as philosophy when I was a student. And also around the same time, interestingly, I also came across Lucretius and read Lucretius and absolutely loved that too. So the combination of those two books kind of set me on a road to become very interested in Hellenistic philosophy in particular. And again, at the time, in philosophy degrees at least, people were taught bits of Plato and Aristotle, but these Hellenistic schools were largely neglected. So I was kind of on my own in terms of digging any deeper. I'd also been reading some stuff about ancient political philosophy, which talked about the Cynics and talked about Zeno and the early Stoics and their kind of utopian political philosophy, which I found very interesting. And then, as part of my degree, I studied the philosophy of Spinoza. And as you may know, there are all sorts of fascinating resonances between Spinoza's philosophy and ancient Stoicism, even though it's not entirely clear whether there was any direct influence or not. But nevertheless, Spinoza comes to lots of views, perhaps entirely under his own steam, that resonate with ancient Stoic ideas. And as I was working on Spinoza, I came across a number of pieces of scholarly literature that said, hey, there are these connections between Spinoza and the Stoics. So kind of a number of these different discussions were going on sort of, in my intellectual world. And they were all independently pointing me towards Stoicism. And I thought, okay, maybe this is the thing that joins all the dots between these various things I'm interested in at the moment. And it just kind of went from there. And I suppose one really key moment in terms of pushing me on my subsequent trajectory was discovering completely by chance in a bookshop Pierre Hadot's Philosophy as a Way of Life.
Yeah.
I just finished my undergraduate degree. I was deciding what I was going to do next. I had very wide interests, and it was 1995. The book had just come out. I just found it on a table by chance, and I read it, and this is exactly what I've been looking for. This really kind of presents ancient philosophy in this fascinating, existential, life-changing way that's completely different from the way in which people would teach, I don't know, Aristotle's logic or Plato's theory of forms. It was just a whole new perspective on what ancient philosophy could be. And that was really the decisive moment in saying, okay, this is the thing that I'm going to study as a graduate student and then hopefully pursue further.
Selfishly, I'm going to jump in here real quick. I'm obsessed with Spinoza right now there, John. And right next to me, I just got the book, Spinoza and the Stoics by John Miller. I have not started it yet. Do you recommend me going through this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know John well, but we've corresponded a few times. He very kindly sent me a copy of that book when it first came out. He really knows his stuff. That book will be a thorough education. So yes, I definitely recommend it.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in, Mark, and say that it's so interesting that you had a sort of a life-changing experience reading Hadot. We have both of Hadot's major books presented in our Marcus Aurelius program, which is our year-long training for those students that want more than the SES can give. It is life-changing. They do shift because of this sort of personal but very rigorous approach to thinking about how to apply Stoic ideas. So I'm delighted to hear about that in you too.
John, are you a practicing Stoic yourself?
Well, it depends what you mean by practicing. I mean, I've always thought that's an interesting question, right? I mean, what does it mean to practice Stoicism? I mean, you'll both be aware of, strange places on the internet where people think that being a Stoic means taking cold showers and, doing all sorts of other weird and wonderful things. So, yeah, I mean, I certainly don't do that. But if practicing a Stoic means, trying to, inculcate certain Stoic attitudes, trying to benefit from some of these ideas in my daily life, then yeah, absolutely. And I'm not sure that was necessarily a conscious decision or that I would have put it in those terms. But obviously I've spent a lot of time over the years with these texts, and I certainly know academic philosophers who study philosophers whom they hate, and they find it kind of like an intellectual workout to be struggling with something that they fundamentally disagree with. And that was obviously never my approach. I wanted to work on the Stoics because I was deeply sympathetic towards them. So yeah, I have that sympathy, and inevitably, if you read Epictetus every day for years and years and years, then it starts to seep into your ways of thinking for sure.
Mark, I wanted to jump in here. Eric Weingart started a website years ago called the Stoic Registry, which was a place for philosophers to come and declare themselves a Stoic. And we still get, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 international people a month declaring, which is an interesting thing. Do you see yourself as a philosopher first and maybe have with Stoic leanings at this point? You have a book out on Aristotle. You're obviously very broadly read. What is there a need for us to put ourselves in these kinds of titular categories? What are you thinking?
I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, what does it mean to be a Stoic, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, seriously. I mean, this is a question that I've been thinking about more and more in recent years. What does it mean to say that? I mean, there was a time when you could point to a Stoic, right? Because those were literally the gang of people that met at the Painted Stoa. It was a club, right? You were either part of the group or you weren't. And there's a very interesting sort of idea that you find in the recent scholarship, which is after that came to an end in like the 1st century BC. Once you get into the slightly later period, this question immediately arises: what does it mean to be a Stoic? Right? There were books. There were papyrus scrolls by Chrysippus or Cleanthes or whoever. You could pick them up and read them, and you could think, "Hey, I think these guys are onto something. I'm going to do something with this." And so there's a sense in which people were just reading books and then self-identifying as Stoics, which is pretty much the same situation that we have today, right? It's not as if there's anything beyond that. So, and again, I mean, thinking about your question, do you consider yourself a philosopher or do you consider yourself a Stoic? Well, I take it if you think of yourself as a Stoic, by definition, you are already a philosopher, right? Because we're talking about philosophy here, right? This isn't a religion. This isn't a cult. This isn't a set of narrow doctrines that you sign up for and commit yourself to dogmatically, right? This is philosophy. The ancient Stoics are constantly arguing amongst one another. They have differences of opinion about certain doctrines, and then they kind of, there's enough that they all believe in that they can kind of hang together as a group in some way. I guess being a Stoic these days is kind of broadly similar, right?
Yeah.
You hear people, you hear people make distinctions between so-called modern Stoics and so-called traditional Stoics, as if these are, that there are kind of huge differences. And the fact that people might have overlapping sets of beliefs or views and not completely coincide strikes me as, something perfectly normal and natural and what you'd expect from anyone who's kind of thinking for themselves, right?
Right. And certainly not really a polarization, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that we see in amongst ancient Stoics is people reading the works of other ancient philosophers, right? So Seneca is reading Epicurus and Lucretius, and Epictetus is reading lots and lots of Plato because he wants to learn lots about Socrates, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea that we might today also be interested in learning about Epicurus or Aristotle or Spinoza or any other philosopher, whilst also feeling a strong sympathy towards the Stoics, feels like, perfectly in tune with what the ancient Stoics were doing too.
Do you mind telling us a little bit about, since you mentioned Aristotle, your latest book published in 2023, Aristotle, Understanding the World's Greatest Philosopher?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, a short introduction aimed for people new to Aristotle. So, I mean, a large part of my sort of academic career, almost by accident, has been working on a research project based in London on ancient philosophical commentaries on Aristotle. And so I've kind of been reading bits and pieces of Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition quite a bit over the last 20 years, alongside my own kind of work on Stoicism. And although in one sense, I wouldn't describe myself as an Aristotelian, in another sense, I mean, he's just an incredible thinker. I mean, just absolutely incredible. The more time I spend with him, the more impressed I am with his works. And I think one of the things I try and argue for in that book in particular is that there are two ways in which you might think about being an Aristotelian. One way is to kind of sort of slightly dogmatically say, I think Aristotle's got all the right answers. I'm going to believe everything he says, right? Which, again, sounds like a profoundly unphilosophical way to approach philosophy. And I think that that's a real kind of that's a really sort of confused way to understand what Aristotle's doing, right? I mean, there's a kind of a story that we get that, the early modern scientists like Francis Bacon and all the rest of them were fighting against the kind of the monolithic authority of Aristotle, the medieval scholastic figure. And Aristotle wasn't like that at all. Aristotle was a natural scientist. He was a philosopher. He was open-minded, inquiring, just interested in the world and trying to understand it. And I think there's a sense in which anyone who's just interested in the world and trying to understand things is kind of almost automatically an Aristotelian, right? This is what Aristotle was doing. He wasn't building some huge scholastic system of thought. He was just trying to understand nature and our place in it. So I think in that sense, we can all be Aristotelians in that sense, alongside whatever other philosophical interests we might have.
Mm-hmm.
What would be another ancient philosopher you'd be interested in writing a book on someday? Spinoza?
I doubt I'd ever write a book on Spinoza. I think that moment has passed for me. I was deeply fascinated in him a long time ago, but there are others that are working on him now. I did write a short book on Epicurus. Again, in the US, this is the Pocket Epicurean. And again, Epicurus and Lucretius have remained firm favorites throughout. And I'll take a leaf from Seneca on that you can be a good Stoic and still learn something from Epicurean friends as well. In terms of other people that I'd like to write on, one person I've become very interested in recent years, a much later thinker, is the early Renaissance humanist Petrarch, who I think is a fascinating figure, deeply interested in Stoicism, draws heavily on Cicero and Seneca, reads their works, and is really interested in what we might call the psychotherapeutic side of Stoicism. He was a troubled soul and he needed help. And through reading Seneca and Cicero, he found lots of useful ideas that I think benefited him. And so I think I find him an interesting figure, and I'd be quite interested to work more on him in the future, particularly in relation to the reception of Stoic ideas in the Renaissance.
So for this podcast, we're trying to make it very conversational and fun. So we're having an episode up and coming, the top 5 Stoic movies, or movies that have some potential Stoic themes behind them. So John, I got to ask you, if you could have one movie that you think has some kind of Stoic theme to it, what would be your answer?
There's one movie that was recently recommended to me by a friend, which I, in fact, have never seen, but is on my to-watch list, which is Bridge of Spies, starring Tom Hanks. And there's a neat clip of this that a friend of mine recommended to me, where the guy is in court and he's convicted, and his lawyer turns to him and says, "You don't seem very upset about this," to which the Tom Hanks character says, "Would it help?"
There you go.
There you go.
That was neat.
I'm going to put that on my whiteboard.
So, John, if listeners want to learn more about you or order some of your books, where's your website, social media, stuff like that we can share?
So I have a website, which is just johnsellars.org.uk. I do have a couple of social media accounts, but I'm deeply ambivalent about them and don't use them much. but via my website, people can get my contact details if they want to get in touch, and always happy to hear from people by email.
Thank you for tuning in to the College of Stoic Philosophers podcast. Please visit the collegeofstoicphilosophers.org for information on the college, e-journal, and course offerings. Till next time, pro cop time.